It's a strange world out there right now. In a few days, we'll know whether a guy from Massachusetts is going to replace the guy from Pennsylvania to be the U.S. Senator from Utah. I think we'll likely see a citizens' initiative pass that legalizes medical marijuana in Utah. And a week later, we'll have an LDS Church-backed compromise rewrite what the citizens just voted for, legalizing marijuana in Utah. But I'm just getting started. In what I call the Californication of Utah, the Citizens Initiative appears to be the new style of governing. There's a strong push to fully expand Medicaid under Obamacare, prioritizing healthcare entitlements above education funding, which has been the primary top priority of Utah in the legislature for decades. With its wholly insufficient $90 million tax increase that's going to come with it. Voters may even demand that the legislature raise gas tax by 10 cents per gallon, a 33% tax increase, for funding for local roads and for more funding for education. In a year of record budgetary increases, budget surpluses, do the voters of Utah really want another tax increase after the various other ones that have taken place? And I want to touch on the tax increase for a minute because it leads into our larger conversation today. It's the idea that the failure to increase taxes is the key issue limiting public education success in Utah. Do you believe that? No. Okay. But that's what a lot of folks, you hear that, don't you? It's an easy soundbite. Utah has the lowest per pupil funding in America. It's not quite true, but go with me anyway. So clearly the system is being starved and children are being deprived. The system needs more, teachers need more. Clearly our kids deserve more, right? You've heard that. More money will ensure that our kids are smarter and more successful. If we just spend a few $100 million more money than the billions and billions of dollars we spend each year on public education, we'll finally pick your happy ending with rainbows and unicorns and puppies, right? But you already know this secret. More money doesn't automatically equate to better education in Utah. While at the bottom of the per pupil spending barrel, our students actually perform above average. And many of the states with the highest spenders are actually average to low performers across the nation. Time after time, we see that student achievement is not directly linked to spending, which isn't to say that all is well in Utah. America's public education system spends $800 billion each year, and the results, according to the system, have been flat. So what are we doing wrong? From my perspective, public education isn't laser focused on student success. First, it's built on a rigid industrial model. Second, it protects the status quo and doesn't embrace change. Third, it promotes patronage over accountability. And fourth, it instills a culture of mediocrity. Former U.S. Secretary of Education Arne Duncan said, and I know many of you are not a fan of Arne Duncan, but they say even a broken clock is right twice a day. So our K-12 system largely still adheres to the century-old industrial age factory model of education. A century ago, maybe it made sense to adopt seat time requirements for graduation and pay teachers based on their educational credentials and seniority. Educators were right to fear large class sizes that prevailed in many schools, but the factory model of education is the wrong model for the 21st century. Would you agree with that? I think there may have been a period of time where these highly standardized systems made a lot of sense for many folks. They were attempting to raise access to education, increase the knowledge and skills that individuals have. They wanted to have a minimum competency level that students all across the nation were able to achieve. So various folks, students didn't struggle in their adult lives. But over time, we have expanded that standardization and that control to essentially all curriculum in our schools. And while standardization can be good because we see it in our cars, we see it in our homes, we see it in our computers, our phones, other things like that, standardization can be a good thing, but it can also be a detriment. I come from the high-tech sector, and so communication standards is one of my specialties. And the standards there have allowed interconnectivity of devices, driving down the cost of what it takes to communicate. If you look at what it costs to communicate decades ago versus today, we've got universal free calling nationwide. There's no long distance, other things like that when you use your cell phone. But if you really want high performance, standardization is a detriment. So companies that wanted really high performing systems custom built those systems. They were not standardized. But as the standards improved and improved to a sufficient level, then those standards overtook the customization and took effect. And I think we see that when we look at our schools right now. We see this heavy standardization. Where are some places you see standardization? Testing. We got our annual and end of level assessments, which from my perspective drive instruction. What else? Curriculum. We got a limited class offering with a very rigid matriculation from class to class to class, and we want it uniform nationwide is what we're driving for. What else? Schedule. We got specific units of measures that dictate our course hours, our semester lengths, our number of days, the pacing of the classes. Absolutely. Where else? Teacher licensing. Okay, you got to have a certain license to even be able to teach the class. I got a buddy who teaches adjunct professor in math at UVU, and I asked him why he doesn't teach at his local high school. It's too bureaucratic for him to go there. He's a PhD in engineering. It's easier to teach at the university than to teach at the local high school. You look at the organizational structure in terms of the departments, and it's pretty much the same, whether you're in Uintah County, whether you're in Alpine School District, or even other districts across the nation. You have a very rigid kind of organizational structure, school after school, district after district. And then what's the other tyranny of the education we have? We have bells constantly going off throughout the day to say when you start and stop learning and when you move from class to class to class, controlling the pacing of everything. It's a fairly rigid system with what I describe as a narrow lane of content. Deviation is difficult to handle. About 15 years ago, the legislature mandated general financial literacy, and my office just completed a review of that program. It's been a requirement for high school graduates now for 10 years, okay? And what did we find? We clearly found teachers who were very passionate about the topic, all the way to teachers who were just filling their schedule and didn't really know much about it. But largely, the administration didn't know what was going on. They had no clue there was an end-of-level test, no idea about how the students were performing. We looked at the assessment. We were concerned about how much of our report relied on the assessment when we considered the assessment ineffective. It was too long. It had questions that had multiple right answers from our perspective, and also questions that had no right answer when there was supposed to be one and stuff. So it was one of these things where, and clearly this assessment was not even being really used to feedback and improve instruction. It was just kind of there. We're going through the paces. So you see something that most educators say that's one of the most critical life skills we teach in school, yet they weren't fully invested in what it took to be successful in that. And the other thing from my perspective is, if you look, since the purpose of the class was to drive behavioral change, how well can you do that in a one-semester class in high school? From my perspective, the system doesn't know how to spread that across 12 years of education. I learned more as a kid doing jobs, picking berries, delivering newspapers, working in a greenhouse, being a bookkeeper, than I ever did in my high school class in financial literacy or personal finance. Students, rather than being able to spread their wings or to embrace areas of interest, they're stuck in the realm where it's perceived that the majority should be learning. This is what we expect students to know. And I ask you, is the rigid model that we have in our schools really in the best interest of students? No. Change is fearful. Lacking meaningful measures, defending the status quo is perceived as safe. Some of you are old enough to remember in the 80s, there was a common saying, nobody was ever fired for buying IBM. Mark, do you remember this? Okay. IBM, even though it was going into decline at the time, it was perceived as safe. That's what everybody bought in their stocks. And I talk about this in 2005. I was asked to be on a discussion about the future of education in Utah. Okay, so this is 2005, a little over a decade ago. And I was speaking to a large group of professional educators. And I asked him, tell me the 3 greatest innovations in public ed in the last 10 years, 20 years, or even 30 years. Okay? Do you know what they said? Wow. Okay, number 1, the whiteboard. The whiteboard. Greatest innovations in public ed in the last 30 years, the whiteboard. Number 2, computers in the classroom. Number 2. Anybody want to guess number 3? Don't worry, because they couldn't figure it out either. Number 3 was, I don't know. Literally, they could only think of 2 great innovations in public ed in the last 30 years. So I had to break the news to them. Based on this, public ed does not embrace change. I think in 30 years, it will look pretty much like it looks like today, which really looks like it did 30 years ago when I graduated from high school. Okay? When is the last time that you saw a superintendent fired for defending the status quo, even when students were failing in that district? How about when a superintendent was actually trying to change the status quo and trying to fix something from his or her perspective? The latter was much more likely. There's a book I really like. It talks about resistance to change. It's called The Box, and it's the history of the shipping container. And I encourage you to go look for this book. It's titled The Box, How the Shipping Container Made the World Smaller and the World Economy Bigger. But in here, it talks about the dramatic story of the container's creation, the decades struggle to make it widely adopted, and the sweeping economic consequences as a result of it. But think about what it took to create, what size should the container be? And if you think back in the day, ships before the container were loaded and unloaded by hand. You're stacking boxes and crates and barrels and other things like that. So you had a lot of breakage, you had a lot of shrinkage, you had a lot of theft that took place. Okay, and it was very costly to ship things. Okay, so when they first put in place some of the early containers, what did the labor unions expect? Whenever you unloaded the container, they wanted to hand unload it, load it into a new container that was then reloaded on a new ship. So the whole purpose of the container was being defeated by the unions that expected to still continue to hand load and unload the containers. Okay, we finally overcome that. We finally come with some standard sizes that fit on trucks, trains, and ships. And now we've gotten to the point where manufacturing facilities can be scattered throughout the world. We've got an amazing amount of products that we can choose from today. And it's so cheap that my wife is in the t-shirt industry. Okay, so you really don't even have to factor in the cost of shipping the shirt from China to the US because it has become so cheap, the cost of shipping is essentially inconsequential over something as lowly as a box of metal, okay? So I ask you, is defending the status quo really in the best interest of students? And I got a no right here. John McDermott from The Economist said, the politicians who are in charge of making education policy see education too often as a source of patronage rather than an area of policy where children come first. Okay? Low-performing administrators are protected at the expense of students. Have you ever heard the term dance of the lemons? Dance of the lemons. Mark has heard it. Oak, you haven't heard this? Okay. This recognizes that certain low performers are shuffled from school to school to school. So you have a lemon in one school, they survive for a couple years, and then they get shuffled off to another school. Okay? And they're shuffled rather than removing them from the system. And I think it's a travesty that they actually have a term for this, for what takes place. Okay? When students fail, what happens? We reward the system with even more money, rather than demanding some type of money-back guarantee. Throughout society, when we get a product that doesn't deliver, what do we expect? We expect our money back, or we expect them to fix it. When it comes to education, what do? we throw even more money at it when they didn't deliver on what was expected before. When your college student retakes a class from high school, when's the last time your school district stood behind that graduation diploma and said, we're going to pay for that class? Anybody ever had that happen? I've never seen it. I think if the education of a child were viewed as a situation of life or death, as it likely is for some highly disadvantaged students, perhaps administrators would not be so cavalier about poor faculty in their schools. Is promoting patronage really in the best interest of students? No. And all of this instills a culture of mediocrity in the system. Regarding question 1, the push for more money is, as I said, being driven for the idea that money will fix the problems in Utah's public education system, despite innumerable examples nationwide that say otherwise. And why would we expect, if we're trying to follow every other state, yet expect a different outcome? What did Einstein call this? Insanity. Okay? And that's what we expect. We're going to copy everybody else, yet somehow Utah is going to be unique. We're going to be different. Doing well in a system of mediocrity is not doing well at all. President George W. Bush talked about the soft bigotry of low expectations. And despite efforts and good intentions, and I think there were good intentions behind No Child Left Behind, that bigotry still exists in too many of our schools and too many of our classrooms. Why are we so quick to blame the students and parents when students fail when we built the system? Why aren't we holding the system that we built accountable when those students fail? Why do we pat ourselves on the back when social promotion kicks in over demonstrated skills and ability? Look at our increasing graduation rates as we lower what we expect for graduation. So for billions of dollars each year, we've set up a system with mediocre outcomes at best, and the only solution that those within the system seem to want to talk about is more money, more money, more money to shore up that system. Would you agree with that? Yeah. So I ask, is the culture of mediocrity really in the best interest of students? No. This isn't a world I want for my kids, and I don't think it's a world that you want for yours. We've corralled students. They move at the pace of the teacher, not faster, not slower. They study from the limited options we provide. They jump through our assessment hoops, even when they're poor, and we don't use them to improve instruction. Let me get something out of the way, though, first. There are many great administrators and many great teachers in public education. Okay? Let me tell you about Craig, a math teacher who's available at 6:30 in the morning at his high school to help any student who's struggling in his class learn. Or coming over to visit with a student and her parents to talk about her plans in college to help her be successful when she goes to college. Or Brad, a former superintendent who battled with the teachers union to try and instill greater accountability in how they were meeting the needs of students. Or Dave, who was another former administrator, striving for a college prep track that would better meet the needs of most of the students in his district, who got run out of town for pushing that. Or Rich, who's a new superintendent, who is trying to figure out where the money really goes in his district to make sure it's targeted to help students rather than just to make it convenient for teachers. Or Tammy, a teacher struggling to customize curriculum for special needs students. Or Roger, a former teacher who was helping students learn the passion for ballroom dance. Or my friend Cole, a financial literacy teacher who's searching for better ways to help kids learn and become proficient with money. There are too many to name. But Edward Deming, has anybody here ever heard of Edward Deming? Mark probably has, Oak has. Okay, Edward Deming probably said it best when he opined, a bad system will beat a good person anytime. Let me repeat that. A bad system will beat a good person anytime. And I might add, especially a highly politicized system, spending billions upon billions of dollars in an avalanche of special interest and money that wipes out whole teams of excellent teachers and administrators. We recognize it's much quicker to just go with the flow than to drive accountability and change. Both require work and risk. And as humans, we're built to avoid that. We like to avoid work, and we like to avoid risk. It's human nature to go with the flow. And Deming, for those that don't know, he is credited as one of the inspirations behind Japan's post-war boom in the 1950s, where they rose from the destruction of war to become the second largest economy. Okay? And his principles were instrumental in Toyota's manufacturing philosophy and approach, which drove radical quality improvements all throughout the auto industry, not just for Toyota, Ford, GM, and so forth. Rarely do I see what is called extreme ownership in public education. Has anybody ever heard of the book Extreme Ownership? Okay, from my perspective, let me touch on a few key takeaways. A leader is only as good as the team that's behind him or her. And a leader is entirely responsible for the actions of the team. Have you ever heard a superintendent take responsibility when students fail? Okay, maybe it's the teacher's fault. Okay, you ever hear the superintendent say, that's my fault, and here's what I'm going to do about it to fix it? I never hear that. When facing failure, a leader must take responsibility and not blame others. If a team member isn't performing, it's up to that leader to mentor that team member. And if it doesn't improve, then in the interest of the team, to make a change and get rid of that team member. Leaders clearly must be confident, but their focus must be on the team and the objectives of that team. We don't see that. We don't see that kind of extreme ownership in public ed. We generally don't see that sense of extreme ownership in government. How often do you see a principal doing whatever it takes to help a struggling student? How often do we expect students to take extreme ownership of their learning and their education versus letting them pass the buck on somebody else? It's been said by dozens of people, dozens of different ways, men behave wisely after they have exhausted all other resources. And I think we're at the point where we're exhausting all of our resources. So how do we fix it? First of all, we need to understand there is no silver bullet. There are no easy answers. There is no quick fix, okay? We have to give up the idea that the next charismatic elected official or billionaire with connections can right the ship by themselves. We have to give up the idea that chanting more competition or school grading or choice will somehow deliver quality education. Second, in general, the kids aren't the problem. In fact, I think the kids are the solution. Despite what we hear in the media, kids are pretty smart, they're pretty driven, they have a pretty good idea where they'd like to go. Teresa Amabile, a Harvard social psychologist, said, kids come intrinsically motivated to learn, and we stamp that out of them through the educational system. You believe that? Yes. I joke with folks, you walk into a first grade class and you ask kids, are you great at drawing? They all raise their hand. Are you great at singing? They all raise their hand. Are you great at, pick whatever it is. They're great at everything, okay? When you go into a class of high school seniors and you ask them that same question, what did you find out? We taught them throughout the system all the things they're not good at, okay? Yeah, you're not good at art, you're not good at math, you're not good at this and that and the other. So I think what we need is an education that is first, student-focused, and second, student-driven. When I say student-focused, we need to shift from the mass production of education to the mass customization, where we fit the education to the student rather than forcing the student to fit our system. We let the students study when they want, what they want, with flexibility over how and where they want to study. Burger King pitches have it your way. You remember those commercials? Have it your way. What does public education today pitch? Have it our way, whether you like it or not, and whether it works for you or not. Right? The system, it really isn't built for the kids. The system is built for the adults. But to make this scale, it has to be student-driven. The students have to own their education, which is pretty much the opposite of what we have today. Each student must be fully engaged in his or her educational goals and outcomes. Speaking about the Model T, Henry Ford said, "Any customer can have a car painted any color they want as long as it is black." General Motors challenged that years later, coming along with some greater customization, some limited set of colors and limited set of options. Today, Tesla radically changes that with computer control of cars. Elon Musk talks about his track mode, where they open up a bunch of settings. You can start controlling the traction, the battery temperature, all of the performance aspects of the car, customizing it to your driving desire. Okay? When we talk of mass customization, think of the clothing industry. My son used to work in this industry. In the past, custom suits were the purview of the wealthy. Okay? Today, accepting a couple weeks delay, I can purchase a custom-fitted suit chosen from a plethora of patterns and styles with special stitching, monogramming, lining for a price comparable to today's discount suits. And in some cases, the customer can even fit themselves and order it from the convenience of their home and never have to talk to a sales representative. Another fun thing is, you look at this right here. This is my daughter. No, this isn't mine. This is my daughter's cell phone case. There's only one of these in the world. Okay? This is her artwork. She loves to draw. And for Christmas, we took one of her drawings and ordered it printed on a cell phone case. Okay? For essentially the same price as you pay for any other case. They were able to take the drawing, put it on there, send it to us for no increase in cost. This is what I talk about, mass customization. Musician Wynton Marsalis said, "If you want to learn something, I can't stop you. And if you don't want to learn it, I can't teach you." Do you believe that? Totally. You're a teacher. Do you believe that? What we need is for kids to own their own education. And if they don't own it, they're not going to be invested in it. And will instead be just going along for the ride. And too often, that's what happens today. We have a teacher that has partial ownership and too many kids that just coast along, get promoted from year to year to year. Now, when you think about owning it, I come from the tech sector, as I mentioned earlier. You're probably aware in the tech sector they have an interesting concept where they let folks pitch ideas and study areas that they want to do on paid company time. Okay, at Google, it used to be 20% of your time could be on your blue sky idea. Now, you had to get it approved by management. You had to have certain goals and targets that you were focusing on, but you could go off and figure things out, which made Google one of the most innovative companies in the world. And you have things, Gmail and Google Maps came out of Google's work there. In other companies, you had Twitter, Slack were also some of these side projects. Microsoft has something similar. They've got their Inclusive Technologies Lab. And you had an individual there who was testing game controllers. Different companies would build game controllers. They would test it. And he started seeing some other unique game controllers coming through. So he started researching it and found out that certain disabled folks were custom building their own game controllers that would meet their needs. Perhaps it was a military man or woman who lost a limb or something like that, developing a controller that they could use. And from that, they expanded a business, started doing some side research, and started scaling that out to customize game controllers to audiences with unmet needs. And in this case, we need to empower teachers to become learning coaches rather than just directing students day to day, week to week. When I think about coaches, I think about Rod Harmon. I did swim team and water polo when I was in high school, and Rod was my coach. And anybody here ever play water polo? Okay. Think about treading water, okay, the egg beater, okay? First day, first time in water polo, it's like, okay, wait a second, we're supposed to be able to tread water for a couple hours? I mean, actively tread water, not just kind of lounge there in the water, but actively tread water? Okay, so that first day or two of practice was killer. But by the end, it was like, yeah, no big deal. Yeah, we could tread water egg beater style around the pool for 2 hours without breaking a sweat. Rod helped us push us beyond where we thought we could go. Okay? They stopped giving me the mile swim merit badge in Scouts because once you're on the swim team, doing a mile swim is no big deal. You can kick that out in a half hour, okay? But Rod would be able to push us, help us set goals, and help us stretch beyond what we thought was possible to achieve those goals. And no, I don't think this is an easy step, but I do think it's a necessary step. 30 kids in the classroom are not and have not been suited to the same lesson at the same pace, nor will they all need it, nor will they be interested in it. And while my good friend, for example, Mark, private school options could be something that could drive change, but there's historically been too many hurdles and barriers for widespread adoption of some of these concepts. And our charter schools, while in theory maybe they could provide some of this, are so burdened with regulations, they can't break out from under that. I know many of you have probably heard, you want to see the future of public ed? Look at charter schools. I like to tease folks and say, you want to see the future of charter schools? Look at your neighborhood school. Because every year there's more and more regulations piled on. They can't get out from under that to create the innovation that I think we need. Now, to create competition, too often we want to go head to head. And when you're the small person competing with the big behemoth, okay, typically you lose and it's a bloody experience. And people talk about red oceans when it comes to that kind of head-to-head competition, okay? So market strategists will tell you, look for blue oceans. Have you heard this concept? Sail into blue oceans, okay? And tackle opportunities in these blue oceans where there's not head-to-head competition. And I think public ed is filled with these kind of blue oceans. Here are some unmet or underserved opportunities I think we have in public ed. How about some less popular or less traditional world languages, like Arabic, or Chinese, or Greek, Russian, or Hebrew? Most high schools don't offer these kind of classes, but there are clearly students that would be very interested in taking them. I have a friend coming back from Nepal. How about a class about the art and history of Nepal? I've never heard about one of those in my local high school. Perhaps the science and math of music, or Japanese mythology. We talk a lot about Greek and Roman mythology. I don't ever hear anybody talking about Japanese mythology. Perhaps the physics of medieval weapons of war. I bet there's going to be some teenagers that would really love that class. I would have loved a class about the introduction to Austrian economics, or the secrets of mental math, or even how to start a business while still in elementary school. As I mentioned, my daughter loves art. She's currently studying computer animation at the University of Utah. And she went to a very good high-end high school, Lone Peak High School, okay? And they had your traditional drawing and painting classes. There were no classes in computer animation. There was no opportunity for her to take computer animation. She's known she's wanted to do computer animation for years. But this was outside the lane of what we offered in the traditional offering, okay? So there was not this opportunity for her to branch into that. Clayton Christensen, anybody here ever heard of Clayton Christensen? Yeah. Clayton's a Utah native and the father of the theory of disruptive innovation. In disruptive innovation, let me touch on this real quick for you. An incumbent focuses on improving their products and services for their most demanding and typically their highest paying customers. Okay, they exceed the needs of many customers and maybe don't even address the needs of other customers. So you get new entrants who are coming in targeting those unmet markets, okay? And they offer something with functionality that's more suitable to the low end at a price point that meets the low end, and clearly it's insufficient for the high end of the market. And the incumbents continue as those new entrants come in, the incumbents move higher and higher up to meet the needs of their most demanding customers. As those entrants start getting better and better and can meet the needs of more and more of the market. Ultimately, the quality and price point and performance of those entrants' offerings undercuts and typically overcomes the high-end performers. So you think about this, let's go back. I mentioned Japan earlier. Think of the transistor radio, okay? Back in the 50s when it was created, okay? It was cheap, it had lousy sound quality. Anybody here remember the transistor radios? Okay, a couple of you, DeVerl here. Okay, was it lousy sound quality? Way back in the day? Okay, it could not compete with those tabletop radios that were out there. Okay, but they were portable, right? And what could teenagers do? They could go listen to their rock and roll music out of the earshot of mom and dad. Okay? It tapped an unmet need. Okay? It was better than nothing. Okay? And then the quality and performance improved year after year after year. And now we're at the world where I can go buy a little Apple iPod Shuffle. Okay? It holds 32 hours of music. It's about the size of a quarter. Okay? With amazing sound quality. Okay? Where are our tabletop radios today? They're essentially non-existent. So what does this mean to education? It means that we need to leverage educational tools and instructional techniques that, while maybe less preferable to the in-classroom teacher or the tutor, are better than nothing. You sit there and look at online classes or Khan Academy, YouTube lectures, books, podcasts, distance learning, Lego Mindstorm kits, Raspberry Pi programming kits, okay? Over time, history tells us that these will likely become better and better, strengthening and expanding learning opportunities, okay? Emerging technology has its part to play, and while it's not the answer to everything in education, it's clearly part of the answer. And also, many throughout tech as if it's a silver bullet. It is not a silver bullet. But we have too many schools also push back against tech. Maybe it's because it threatens the status quo. Maybe it's because they think it's insufficient to meet the needs that they're currently offering. But we need to start looking at those areas that are being unmet. So how do we get there from here? I think we need to instill these concepts within the traditional school system. I don't think we can just be out here on the fringes trying to drive that change. I think we need to somehow drive at the heart of the system with something safe enough for them to embrace, effective enough to celebrate, and large enough to drive change. So perhaps we could start with something as simple as letting first graders have 45 minutes a day to study anything they want to. Okay? Maybe that's reading, maybe that's math, maybe that's going outside to watch insects burrow in the dirt, or pounding rocks to see what happens as they crumble there on the sidewalk. We need to let kids get outside of this rigid pedagogy. We already have the concept of study hall, right? This just takes that a step further, empowering students and unleashing them to study what they want. Okay? We still have the rest of it, but maybe 45 minutes a day, we could let them drive their own education. And then maybe over time, we can expand and expand. Perhaps with second graders, we give them more time. We also add the expectation of what are the goals and outcomes that they expect from their chosen area of study, so they start taking more ownership of it. And maybe by the time we get to junior high school, students can control half of their learning opportunities. And maybe by the time they get in high school, they can control all of it. Yes, this isn't going to be quick. It's going to be threatening. It takes time. But maybe we can start from something as simple as that to really drive change throughout the system. And for those that are concerned, we can still have a common core. Sorry, I was just checking to see if everybody's still awake out there. But you can still have a basic set of math and language arts skills that we expect students to be able to achieve, and still create this safe space to have students own more and more of their educational opportunity. If we wake up tomorrow and we said every kid at Lone Peak High School is going to be self-directed learning, they're going to choose everything they want, the system will crumble. The administration won't know how to deal with it, the teachers won't know how to deal with it, the parents won't know how to deal with it, and the kids won't know how to deal with it. They have never had that opportunity to really control that. They won't know how to go. But maybe if we can start from first grade and expand and expand and expand, we can create that opportunity where students have much more control and say over their learning opportunities. To be able to tailor their education to their needs and their challenges and their desires. So rather than nibbling around the edges of the educational system, I think we must drive at the heart of the system, but don't engage in the bloody hand-to-hand combat. Let's target and search for those blue oceans and leverage disruptive technology. We must demand that education be focused on each and every student, The need to expand educational opportunities should happen within the existing budgets, and I think it can. And we need to leverage students to control and manage their education to a greater and greater extent. And I appreciate your time. Thank you very much. Yes, so the question was really about getting at the root rather than the fruit of the problem, and about the engagement of the federal government. And yeah, I agree, the federal government is going to drive a certain agenda, whether it's just on the assessment side, which ultimately drives instruction, or whether it's actively driving instruction, it will have an influence. Now, here's one area that I would go even further than that. Even at the state level, I have concerns about the state driving a certain agenda and driving a certain curriculum, and I would drive that lower and lower down into the school level, recognizing that different communities have different interests, and ultimately, from what I described, different students have different interests. So part of the dynamic, I mean, I think there's an element where you can somewhat ignore certain aspects of what the federal government does. You have to be willing to put at risk certain federal dollars, and I think we should be able, I mean, to a certain extent, it is not that much in terms of the whole system of public ed. Certain areas in terms of Title I and special needs students have a disproportionate amount of federal dollars in there, but in lots of the other systems, you don't have as much of that federal money. But I think you have to start moving down this path. And you can still start from what I described is, okay, great, for these first graders, okay? Most of the day is still this core stuff, but we're starting to embrace this element of freedom. And then we try and figure out how to get there over time. From my perspective, if we just stand and say, okay, we're gonna have private schools do it, or maybe we're gonna have charter schools do it, it's not gonna really drive the change. So what I was trying to do is, how do I go into the system and not challenge it head to head, but to say, here are opportunities that we can have a safe area, leveraging study hall, to let students expand out from the normal lane of instruction, to then see how that works. And I think it will be successful over time, and parents will clamor for that.
That could increase people back.
Yes, but ultimately what happens is too often we want to say, oh, our politicians don't listen to us. And really politicians are kept on a very short leash. They largely represent the majority of what their constituency wants, because if they don't, they have what I call an end of leash experience. Okay, they get yanked back because they got too far away from their constituency. So here's where I would disagree slightly with you. I agree with the philosophy. What I would disagree is that our current system addresses your concern. In some cases, we have teachers that are very good at teaching the Constitution and what it means and the history behind it. Too often, I run into students that the Constitution they learned in their class isn't anywhere near the Constitution that I studied.
That's my point.
Yeah, and so relying on the current system to just answer that, I think history shows we have not been successful in that attempt. And this is where, in my mind, you can encourage students as part of their self-study. Here are some of the founding documents. Here are the founding writings, other things like that, so they can start to understand more than just the sugar-coated perception. I mean, when I went through school, and I went through a pretty good high school, I would have told you, hey, that Constitutional Convention was a couple days, they had a little bit of arguments, they came to agreement, boom, they went on their merry way. I had no clue the months and months and months of effort that went into it, and the arguments back and forth, and the challenges of it almost falling apart along the way. I didn't understand that until years and years later. So, yep. So thank you very much. Oak is here to yank me off. I really appreciate your time. Thank you very much.